Hi, this is Mitch Randall, CEO of Good Faith Media, and we want to welcome you to this month's Good Faith Advocates webinar. We're really excited about our guest today, Dr. Joerg Rieger from Vanderbilt University. And we're going to hear from Dr. Rieger here later on in this podcast, or excuse me, in this webinar. There's a lot of exciting things happening at Good Faith Media over this last month. We have been on the road at places like Little Rock, Arkansas, attending meetings with Alan Bosak from South Africa and Judge Wendell Griffith from Arkansas. And then we were off to Louisville, Kentucky, to Simmons College of Kentucky to hear the big announcement this week by President Kevin Cosby as they launched the new instituted Jesse L. Jackson Center for Racial Justice. It's been an exciting month here at Good Faith Media, and we're really excited to share with you all that's going on. Some resources that are available for you this month. We want to just remind you that we just finished publishing our 40th anniversary edition of Nurturing Faith Journal and Bible Study. And the new issue has recently just come out. If you're not a subscriber to the journal, we want to encourage you to sign up today because there's a lot of incredible articles in there written by fabulous authors from across this country. Also, another resource I want to draw your attention to is Tony Cartledge's commentary on from the lectionary entitled Nurturing Faith Commentary, a lectionary resource for preaching and teaching. Dr. Cartledge has been teaching at Campbell Divinity School and is an incredible scholar. He's been writing our Bible study curriculum for several years now. And he's put all those writings into a commentary series, and that's available at our bookstore at goodfaithmedia.org. Also this month at goodfaithmedia.org, we have been publishing a lectionary series that is absolutely fantastic by multiple authors. And we want to encourage you to check out all of those articles, as well as all the articles that have been published on our site this month. We've also had numerous podcasts produced, as well as a new podcast by our director of the Raceless Gospel, Reverend Starlette Thomas. And she is here today to tell you a little bit about what's going on with Raceless Gospel and an upcoming new season of Raceless Gospel podcast.
It's a brief introduction. I'm Starlette Thomas. As you've heard, I'm the associate editor, the director of the Raceless Gospel Initiative, but also host of the Raceless Gospel podcast, which is cleaning up the North American church's toxic environment by addressing that taboo trinity: race, religion, and politics. Christians are stepping on the heels of Jesus during the Lenten season, so I created a series. Testing, 1, 2, 3, follows Jesus from the wilderness to the foot of his cross, where his disciples will be tested, and we will wonder aloud if they have listened to a word he said. The answer, of course, will come in 1, 2, 3 days. It's a 7-episode series. Beat the System is out now and available wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. I hope you'll add this one to the list and make me your podcast pastor. The doors of this church are always open. Thanks.
Thank you, Reverend Thomas. What a great update. And again, I just cannot commend that series to you. It's a great podcast that you're going to want to listen to. Not only do we have the Raceless Gospel Lectionary podcast, or the Lenten podcast, but also Good Faith Weekly is available. We had some great guests this last month that you want to check out. And then later on in the year, we've got our second narrative podcast that's going to be released, that is produced by our media producer extraordinaire, Cliff Vaughn. And it's about the Second Baptist Church in Little Rock, Arkansas, and their history of doing racial justice in the city of Little Rock and what that means for them today. It's an incredible story that you're not going to want to miss out on. Well, we are here today with a very special guest. Last month, You heard the report from the United Nations that our globe is in crisis. We are heading towards the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase faster than anyone has anticipated. We need to slow down global warming. And we all have a responsibility to do that. As people of good faith, we feel compelled by our faith to engage in creation care and advocate for policies that are going to slow down global warming and reach the goals of reducing carbon emissions by 60% over the next decade. So we are asking our advocates to make certain that you engage in conversation as well as in advocacy about what is going on in this world. We've only got one world, and God has given us the responsibility to care for it and to be responsible human beings. So let's do our part. Well, we have a very special guest with us today. Dr. Joerg Rieger is Distinguished Professor of Theology, the Cal Turner Chancellor's Chair of Wesleyan Studies, and the founding director of the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice. Previously, he was the Wendland-Cook Endowed Professor of Constructive Theology at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. Rieger authored and edited 26 books and more than 175 academic authors. A selection of his books include Theology in the Capital Scene, Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity, which I just finished yesterday, and it is fantastic. Jesus versus Caesar for people tired of serving the wrong God. No Religion but Social Religion, Liberating Wesleyan Theology, and many more other volumes. Would you please welcome to our webinar, Dr. Joerg Rieger.
Thank you so much for having me, Mitch. It's great to be on your program. I look forward to the conversation that emerges from this also, because I think those are really important issues that we need to address, not just because they're burning issues. I mean, they definitely are in our time, but also as people of faith, we want to know what difference does our faith here make for good and for ill, and what contributions can we make to turn things to the better. I have a couple of quick slides. I'll share my screen here. I think you should be able to see it. Let me make sure I get the right. There we go. This is the title of my presentation today, which is ecological justice and capitalism. You had asked me to talk about that. And of course, I want to talk about religion here. What difference does religion make in this world? I'm putting up this slide because I want to point your attention to this Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice that I'm directing at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. You see our web address here, also www.religionandjustice.org. And feel free to check it out, because this is the kind of work that we're doing, and we're doing some new projects that might be of interest to you, and perhaps even invite your participation in some of the things that we're doing. Here's a quick slide of the new book that Mitch just mentioned, Theology in the Capital Scene, Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity. And my presentation today is from the first chapter, really, of this book, talking about not only the problems, but the solutions. This is what we're interested in here. How can we actually make a difference as people of faith? The next two slides are just two quick examples of the work that we're doing at the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice. The first one is an interventions forum, Climate Change and Capitalism. You have the web address for that here as well. The second one is a current series that we're doing, Economic and Ecological Alternatives. So we're really always asking the question of alternatives. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute. So this is just a little bit of show and tell so that people can actually see the kinds of things that we're doing. And now let me move on and say a few things before we then go into a conversation. It may not be obvious why it does make sense for us to talk about ecological justice and capitalism together? Because usually we talk about one or we talk about the other, right? My short answer to why do we talk about those together is because we need to understand the deeper nature of our problems if we want to really come up with solutions and make a difference. So the point here is any critique is always geared to the solution. So this is not a question of complaining or moaning about our predicament, but really asking the question, how can we make a difference and how can we move forward together? Now, people who are interested in the ecology, in the environment, in things like climate change, for a long time have talked about the fact that we're living in what people say is the Anthropocene. This is one of the markers for this whole series of geological epochs. You probably heard about the Holocene. This is the last 11,000 years of geological time when humanity emerged after the Ice Age. You know, before that was the Pleistocene, what was called the Ice Age, still is called that. About 2.5 million years ago until about 11,000 years ago, that was the Ice Age. Now it's the Holocene, the last 11,000 years. And so some people say we're now living in the Anthropocene, meaning this is the time when people, anthropos, human beings, are shaping the fate of the planet. And there's a lot to be said for that because there's a lot of us now, right? Humanity keeps growing numerically. We have a tremendous impact on nature, on ecology, and the planet around us. But what the term overlooks, and this is what I want to talk about today, is that ultimately who is running the fate of this planet is not all 7-8 billion human beings, but it is some human beings more so than others. And of course, we're not talking about individuals. We're talking about broad systems that shape us and that shape our future. So this is why in the new book, I have adopted this term, the capitalocene. This is a term that was developed by an anthropologist, well, a sociologist actually, and a historian, Jason Moore, who says, what if we lived in the capitalocene instead of the Anthropocene, meaning that what shapes us, what shapes the history of the planet all the way to the core is actually the power and the influence of money. And that's not a moral argument where you say some people are good and some people are bad. It's just an assessment of what is it that drives us and what is it that we have to contend with. Now, if you think about how this capitalocene shapes up and the problems that we're dealing with, I think it's not hard to see where the problems lie. So global warming, as Mitch mentioned in the beginning, is a big concern for humanity because in a constantly warming climate on the planet, the future of humanity might be bleak. You know, there may be still a planet, but maybe not humans, maybe not human civilization. Now, what is driving this global warming, and there's an agreement of 97% of scientists today, is the increase in human-produced CO2 emissions. You're probably aware of that. What most people don't know is that there are 70% of these CO2 emissions that are produced not by all of humanity, but by the economic interests of 100 large corporations. So if you're worried about CO2 emissions, the rise of them, and the climate, you have to think about the interests of 100 corporations which produce 71% of global CO2 emissions. So that's significant. Compare that to other concerns that environmentally minded people oftentimes have, like, for instance, the consumption of meat, which also contributes to CO2 emissions through the production of cattle and so on. If all Americans gave up eating meat, needing meat for their food resources, that would only reduce the US CO2 emissions by 2.6%. So we're talking about 71% of CO2 emissions produced by large corporations. Another number might be interesting here also. Between 1988 and 2016, the fossil fuel industry has emitted as much greenhouse gas as in the previous 237 years since the beginning of industrial capitalism. So what's interesting here is that we're constantly producing things that are harmful for the environment and ultimately harmful for humanity. And the question is, what's actually happening and how are we going to deal with it? Now, why am I talking about these things as a scholar of religion, as a theologian, you might wonder. When I talk about the Capitalocene, my question is not simply what does this do to the planet or what does it do to our economic and political systems. I'm also curious about what does this do to our faith. So as a theologian, I'm interested in what shapes our images of God, what shapes our most deeply held emotions and beliefs. And here I have found in my work over time that this is also affected by the Capitalocene. Our images of God are oftentimes shaped by factors that we're not even aware of. The way we think about God is oftentimes more shaped by the principles that shape our age than we realize. Now, there are some historical studies. There's a book by historian Kevin Kruse, who wrote this book, One Nation Under God, subtitle, How Corporate America Invented Christian America. And Kruse shows how big money actually for about 80, 90 years now has helped shape Christianity in such a way that we have what we now have, right? So conservative Christianity, especially in the US, is not just something that happens by default, but something that has been shaped oftentimes by the interests of big money. And again, I want to come back to our images of God. When we think of God now, in ancient times, we thought of God as a king, as a ruler, maybe somebody who looked like the Roman emperor. We're now more likely to think about God maybe as a powerful CEO, you know, or as a president or somebody with power in the system. All examples for how this Capitalocene shapes us all the way to the core. That's why I'm interested in it as a theologian. And again, the question is, what do we do with it? How do we address it? Instead of hand-wringing and say things are not great, how do we make them better? So this is where I really want to talk about the solutions. There are some solutions that we're finding in Christian communities that are concerned about climate change, the environment, the ecology, that I would say are first steps, but perhaps not sufficient. When we talk about money and capitalism, you probably heard this said a lot. There's a lot of complaining about greed, you know, where you blame individuals for being greedy. Sometimes that blame then gets attached to business people, you know, CEOs, the wealthy, you know, could name names here. That may not be helpful if we're talking about the Capitalocene as a much bigger issue, as a system, as an economic system. That's not driven by individuals as much as by the requirements of the system. Another thing that I hear a lot is that people blame consumerism. You know, everybody always wants more stuff, and that's bad for the environment. I mean, in some ways, that's not good, right? But I'm afraid that here, oftentimes, we're blaming the symptoms rather than the deeper reasons and issues. So by blaming individual consumers, you're not really able to address the bigger issues either. One more example here, and this is especially interesting to me. You may have heard and maybe used the so-called carbon footprint calculators. So if you go to the internet, you Google carbon footprint calculators, you can actually find, identify, do the math for your own personal carbon footprint. How much CO2 are you emitting? What's so interesting about these calculators is that they were actually invented and promoted by the fossil fuel industry. BP started it in the early 2000s. And again, not a bad thing to be aware of how much CO2 you are emitting. But these carbon footprint calculators are there so that people look at individuals rather than at the broader interests of corporations that are here at stake. So what's not addressed, and this is the problem when people of faith and others become more aware of what's going on, are the foundations which drive our system ever deeper into the crises. Now, the two factors that are interesting here, I think, are in many ways connected, right? There's environmental factors. In the economic calculations, environmental factors are usually seen as externalities. This is something that doesn't show up in sort of the actual calculations of businesses who are supposed to increase the profit of shareholders. That's just the basic mission of a business. That's the structure we're talking about. And the same is true for labor, what working people are doing. You know, these are considered externalities because in both cases, with environmental factors as well as with labor, the idea is that a good business keeps the cost at the absolute minimum. Now, this shows you perhaps the problem that we're dealing with, right? Because people and the planet who contribute to the economic success that we're seeing today in the capitalist scene are actually not taken at face value, at their full value. Which is, of course, to say that the solutions then when you blame greed and consumerism are not getting you where you need to go because you're not looking at what's actually here at the core of building the system. And of course, what also could then help you to produce the alternatives. So when Christians then talk about, for instance, as a United Methodist, I happen to be ordained United Methodist clergy, when they talk about creation care, when they talk about environmental stewardship, what they're not talking about is why do we need to care about creation in the first place? Why do we need environmental stewardship in the first place? And of course, it's nice. It's better to care than not to care. It's better to be a steward than not to be a steward. But what we're never talking about is how the system actually is built on the exploitation of natural resources and the work of human beings. So this is then the work that we're doing at the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt, because we want to know how would we address the problems as we're addressing the deeper connections here. So if you followed me to this point, I think we could summarize saying the problem that we're up against is the exploitation of nature, could say the extraction of natural resources, and the exploitation of human beings that builds enormous power for the few on the back of the many, that leads to the increase in CO2 emissions, that leads to the increase of economic and ecological production as well as devastation. And once we address it, perhaps we can move forward together in a better way. So we want to find solutions here that address directly these problems. So let's start with the two things considered externalities here, right? Natural resources and human labor. And when you think about human labor, of course, it's not just people working in factories. Of course, after COVID, we're now aware that essential work is actually really essential, right? We hadn't even ever realized how important people are in grocery stores, stacking the shelves, how important people are producing our food, right? How important all these essential workers are without which we could not survive. But let's not think about productive labor only. Let's think about reproductive labor as well. Reproductive labor is what ultimately brings us to this planet, right? Starting with the actual physical labor of your mother, our mothers, right? We would not be here without the reproductive work of our mothers. And that includes not just giving us birth, but also, you know, providing all kinds of support and shelter for us. Oftentimes reproductive labor, of course, is relegated to women and to minorities, and therefore is counted as less, and the same happens to nature, right? Nature constantly works to keep us alive, producing oxygen, you know, there's bacteria, there's sunshine that we need, there's the activity of the soil, there's the trees, there's the animal world. All of that goes into building who we are, into producing our ways of life. And so here, when we reclaim those things, I'm arguing as people of faith, we might have new ways of approaching the issue of environmental devastation, climate change included. And as we do that, I think the real question is, How do we do that as people of faith? Well, let's talk about images of God here as well. On the one hand, we have these top-down images of God, God as ruler, God as perhaps the modern CEO person. But of course, if you go back to our religious resources, we have many other images of God. In the beginning of the Bible and the creation stories, there's an image of God who plants a garden, who makes Adam from clay. So you have God as an essential worker, as it were, rather than God putting to work essential workers, other people, to do the dirty work, but God getting the divine hands dirty and joining the majority of people who have to work for a living. That to me are fascinating images. And then throughout the Hebrew Bible, you get these images of God doing menial labor, oftentimes the work of women that was relegated to women, like sewing, cooking, weaving, working with clay, and so on. So we have some really rich images of an alternative economy that doesn't go from the top down, only interested with the wealth of the shareholders, but really interested in the wealth of the community. So these are images of God, I think, that would be very worthwhile reclaiming. And of course, many other images of God in the New Testament, right? In the ministry of Jesus, where God in the person of Jesus Christ, whose death and resurrection we're commemorating this week, is doing the kinds of things that working people do. So we have a really strong tradition of alternative images where the point is not exploitation of people and the planet, but constructive collaboration, constructive production here, where God is actually doing the kind of work that a lot of people feel like maybe it's beyond us, maybe it's something that is only for the lower classes, the working classes, and so on. But ultimately, as God models it, this is who we are as human beings, working productively, reproductive and productive labor for the common good here. So this is, I think, one powerful image that helps us rethink not just how we do business with each other, but how the ecology functions also, because now we can include images of, the broader cosmos working together for the common good. If you look again at the creation stories, you have some images of water and the earth bringing forth the plants, bringing forth animals with the help of God in God's creation. And valuing these things in a new way, I think, is what is at the core of what we're talking about. Keep in mind, this is certainly at the heart of our Christian traditions, but you find this at the heart of the Jewish traditions also. We're already talking about the creation stories. And by the way, some of these stories are also shared in the Muslim traditions. In the Quran, you also have God creating Adam by hand and planting a garden. Another image that's always central part of the three Abrahamic traditions is the Exodus from Egypt. Again, you have God taking the sides of the Hebrew slaves, leading them to freedom, speaking out of a burning bush to Moses, making things better, making things change. So my point here is if there is a connection between the ecology and the economy. In other words, if the way we run the economy now is what ultimately does damage to the ecology and human beings, what if we rethought how we do business? What if we rethought how we relate to each other? So this is the work that we're doing in the Wendland-Cook Program. One of our recent projects is what we're calling solidarity circles. And these solidarity circles are places where we're bringing faith communities together with examples of what we're calling the solidarity economy. So one example here would be a worker cooperative, where workers cooperatively work together for their own good. They're the ones who are now determining what happens. They're the ones who produce. They are determining who produces what gets produced, who benefits from it, and so on. And here you have a model where profit actually is a good thing. It's not something that just trickles up to the few, but it's something that gets used for the benefit of the community. And the way we're observing it, this is how profit then also gets used for the benefit, not just of the human, but also the other than human economy, which is the exciting thing, right? All of a sudden, you have people taking care of the environment in a much more organic and natural fashion. If you check out the second one of the interventions forums that I mentioned in the beginning, I may be able to put a link here in the chat for you. You have one piece, one contribution here that talks about worker cooperatives benefiting the environment. And those are some of not just experiments that we're doing, but some of the really positive examples that are happening, that are real life examples now. This is not just a dream. This is already going on. What we're finding here, and this is where I want to conclude, is that what is happening here is not only are we developing more holistic, more healthier, maybe more common good oriented approaches to how we live our lives, but also to how we believe, to our faith. So what's happening when we put this cooperative economy together with our faith traditions is we start realizing how much we have missed, learning deeper things about God, about Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, the church, sin and evil, salvation, and ultimately about ourselves, that we as human beings here can make a real difference. That is the exciting thing. And this is the basis for the conversation that I would like to have with you, because here faith now is seen as something that is entirely beneficial for us and for the planet in ways that have not always been realized. There are many critiques out there of faith as having contributed to ecological devastation, and there's good reason, right? Oftentimes people have focused on another world instead of this world, or focused on another world to the exclusion of this world. What we're saying is what happens when we bring these things together? What happens when we put them in conversation? And from there, then reclaim everything, our faith, our relationships, our economic relationships, the way ultimately we do politics, and all the rest. I think this is the good news of the gospel. And this is the sort of thing we're seeing at work where we are. So let me stop my presentation here and see if there are any comments and questions. I know Mitch has a couple of things he would like to discuss.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rieger. We really appreciate that presentation. You've given us a lot to think about, challenged us to think outside of a lot of the normatives that we have embraced. I want to remind our participants, if you have a question for Dr. Rieger, please put that in the chat or in the Q&A. Either one is acceptable. We'll be answering those questions here in just a second. You know, as I heard you talk and deliver your presentation, Dr. Rieger, you know, I was reminded of the old adage, especially our existence within the capital scene, is the old adage of does a fish, or the old question that does a fish know it's in water? And I think a lot of times we do not recognize how powerful these systems are within our world and how much influence they have upon us individually and socially. What advice do you have for our participants in recognizing the capital scene and its harm that it's causing, not only to the planet and the environment, but to communities and individuals specifically?
Right. It's really like the fish in the water, right? Where it's hard to notice these things. And so, of course, my advice would be pay attention, start noticing these things. But maybe a more specific advice here would be to really take a look at where things are deteriorating. This is oftentimes, you know, where you start your awareness of a problem when you see, oh well, this is becoming a real problem. So if you stay with the analogy of the fish, right? A fish is in the water. The water quality gets worse, right? Maybe the fish at some point realizes I have a headache, you know, or something is not working good. You know, then start asking questions. Why is it? I mean, how are these things happening to us? and what's so interesting to me is once you start asking these questions, you realize these are not accidents. This is not just happening. Nobody knows why, but there are some answers. And then to ask these questions, especially in those places where we're not saying a whole lot. So for instance, this is why in the Wendland-Cook program, we're taking a close look at labor, because believe it or not, this is one thing that does not get addressed a whole lot in religious communities. I mean, in my field, professional theology, there's all kinds of conversations now about theology and the economy, which is good. I'm glad we're finally lifting that veil a bit, but we're not really talking about labor yet. So if people now look at labor, this is why I mentioned the pandemic and essential workers. What's happening to these essential workers? And we realize, oh, wow, this is not that great a place to work, right? I mean, some people might know this firsthand, some people might not. But once you look at what's happening, I mean, in Jesus's word, right, to the least of these, you can figure out a few things. And then from there, you look at what's happening to us. So I am a named chair professor at a prominent university. I see the world of academic labor changing. And so this is how you move into it. You see some of these effects in your own life, and then you put it together in the bigger picture.
I'm glad you mentioned labor because, I mean, just recently, some states are trying to roll back child labor laws, in order to gain greater profits and productivity in their specific industries. Also, I want to attach the immigration issue. We have more humans migrating on this planet than we have ever before in search of resources. And a lot of times those are driven by capitalistic instincts and labor, cheap labor at that, basically influencing this incredible migration that we see. So, I wholeheartedly agree with you that a lot of these labor issues are vitally important for us to address, and we can do that as people of faith. That is something that should be in our wheelhouse. We just commemorated the 55th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. I want to remind everybody why he was in Memphis. He was there for labor and for standing up for workers there in Memphis when he was assassinated. So this is something that is in our DNA, something that we certainly need to address. So thank you for that. We have a question from one of our attendees. The Willow Project has been in the news recently. What do you know about the situation and how will it impact the environment?
Not quite sure what the Willow Project is. I'm sorry, maybe I should be aware of it.
Okay. Well, whoever posed that question, if you could give us more information, Dr. Rieger will be happy to address that. But we do have another question. Climate change and the U.S. foreign policy also drives immigration. And so what can we do as people of faith, Dr. Rieger, to address these issues? And what's the best strategy, I guess, for us as people of faith to do so?
Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, again, it leads back to my overall argument. If we look at what is creating the tensions in which we find ourselves, we can actually then move towards solutions. So if you think about immigration here specifically, and you already talked about immigration and search for resources. Now the question is about immigration and climate change. People are not leaving their home countries just because they want to live somewhere else. They don't come to the US just because we have such a great country. They often come because of dire necessities, search for resources, labor, survival, climate change, and so on. And what I'm finding in our faith communities, I find a lot of open communities that talk about inclusion, hospitality, and so on. But unfortunately, these conversations usually don't talk about the causes, right? So we want to help, we want to be part of a solution, but we don't often dare to ask these deeper questions. What's happening? How are we actually in this confronting a problem and then have to address it. So my response here would be to say, spending time with immigrants, being in ministry with them, again, is something where you learn about what's going on, not just what's happening to them, but also who we are, right? Somebody mentioned U.S. foreign policy. You learn a lot about U.S. foreign policy by talking to non-U.S. people, by the way. More so than you learn from our own news outlets once in a while. However, I want to bring this back to the theological discussion to really think about, maybe just quickly backtracking to the labor issue, to think about these as genuinely theological issues. So if you think about labor not just as an ethical mandate, but you think about God's self as being involved in work and labor, right? Think about Jesus's ministry coming from a working class background in Galilee. And then, of course, migration and immigration, same thing, right? The Holy Family there being migrants to Egypt at one point themselves, being forced out for some foreign policy that's been maintained by the Roman Empire and its vassals. So it's those kinds of things that then help us understand not just what's our moral task here, but who is God and how is God leading us out of these problems into a new way of relating to each other. You may be muted right now, Mitch. I cannot hear you.
You're right. I was muted. I apologize.
There we go.
We have another question. I apologize for that, everybody. The question is this: what are some practical ways to live sustainably within a capitalistic system that necessitates the continual production and consumption of goods and services?
Yes, that's a great question. Let me say one thing I always need to repeat. When we are talking about capitalism here, this is not so much a moral argument, having fish moralizing about the water will do the fish no good. This is simply a recognition of the world in which we live in order to figure out what might be some of the alternatives. So if we're talking about the production of goods, services, for productive labor, for the well-being of everybody, these things happen. Those things need to happen. So labor here is not just a necessary evil, but it is part of who we are. It's also part of human creativity. It's also part of, So the economy here is not just a matter of how do we provide resources, but also how do we live our lives creatively as human beings? How do we become fully human as we interact with others? So the thing here is not to withdraw from it and to say, well, let's not consume as much anymore, or let's move away, move up to the mountains and form a small alternative community. But the thing is, how can we make these processes more communal? How can we bring things together in a way? So one thing we're exploring here at the Wendland-Cook Program is worker cooperatives. We're working with an outfit here in Nashville called the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development, who is incubating worker co-ops actually in minority communities. So with the goal really of building community welfare, community wealth, starting with the least of these. And what's so interesting here, the practical thing is this creates all kinds of positive feedback, right? Not only are you helping people develop the economic necessities, but in the Southeast here, Nashville, Tennessee, this is a way of fighting racism, empowering minority communities, minority communities empowering themselves by building cooperative businesses is a beautiful thing, because it really does something to affect the broader culture in which we live. It also helps revitalize faith communities. Sometimes my biggest worry about faith communities is we don't even know what we're here for. We don't really even know what is our task. And so if faith communities can see how they're part of the production of the greater common good constructively, productively, that is a very exciting thing. And it sort of revitalizes worship, the way you read the Bible, spirituality, all these kinds of things. But as you can see, I'm pushing it all really back to basic relationships of production, where if we don't pay attention, these things run our lives. What I'm saying is if we pay more attention, we restructure some of our economic relationships, we have a chance now to not only push back, but to live much more creatively and in ways that I think are more God-given.
Amen. One last question from a participant who wants to know more about the solidarity economy. What does this look like, and how can we embody it?
So worker cooperatives are one example, and I think maybe they're the best example. There's a lot of talk about anti-capitalism these days, which sometimes I find is a bit reactionary. Not that people don't have to raise questions, but to think, well, I'm just opposed to this. Well, the question is, what is the alternative? And if you think about the basis of a capitalist business being the extraction of wealth and resources for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many, a co-op is actually the exact opposite, because here now you have the production of wealth and the use of resources for the benefit of the many. So in this sense, this is already one way of talking about an alternative. So worker co-ops for us is really at the very heart of it, because working people are now not just reaping the benefits, but they're also people now who have some agency. We talk about economic democracy, which is a conversation that we're not even having in the United States. We talk about political democracy, as we should, which is very important, and one of part of our history that we should be very proud of, and never go a step back behind it. But the economic democracy piece, I think, here is another thing that we have to talk about. But beyond that, let me give you a few more examples. I think the question was about practical examples. Probably everybody knows about consumer cooperatives. This is, REI, the sporting goods company, is a consumer co-op, right? There are many others. There's King Arthur, I think Flour is a consumer co-op. No, they're also a worker co-op, I believe. So you have all kinds of examples. Community-owned grocery stores. Those are all things where people get together. This is all examples of the solidarity economy. And the big one I haven't even mentioned yet, but let me make sure I mention it also. It usually ruffles some feathers with people of faith, especially here in the South. Let's talk about the labor movement, which is also a form of a solidarity economy where working people are simply saying, if we are essential workers, as we are, we want to be treated accordingly, right? And so the Kroger grocery store chain, for instance, is unionized. So Kroger workers oftentimes are better off than other grocery workers, because they have some support, or they collectively can make sure that the profit motive for the top is not the only thing that runs a business. So that's another solidarity economy piece. And then you have some very everyday things that many of your listeners are probably involved in, naming, say, community gardens, very basic neighborhood, mutual aid projects. Those kinds of things also go into that. Maybe mentioning one more thing here, which I find very interesting. This is a huge part of American history that we're not being taught. So in American history, we've had this solidarity economy for a very long time. But what we're taught usually in school and even in the university, this is the country of capitalism. There is no alternative. But no, there are many alternatives. And one very powerful example, there's a book, Jessica Gordon Nembhard is the author. The book is titled Collective Courage. It tells the history of African-American cooperatives. And that's a powerful history. There's a lot happening or used to be happening in Black communities as far as that solidarity economy goes. And these were ways of Black people, African-American people, not only supporting themselves, but really sort of moving towards a much better society for all. The other part of that story, though, that Nembhard also tells is that these things have been oftentimes destroyed because they got too successful. So it's not that these all failed because they weren't sustainable, but they got too prominent, and then there was some pushback from the dominant system that was too much of a challenge. So if you put all that together, I think you have many examples of what's already happening. And for people who want to know more, I mean, again, check out the website of the Wendland-Cook Program, religionandjustice.org, just one word, religionandjustice.org.
Thank you so much for that explanation. In fact, as you were explaining the solidarity economy, I am Muskogee Creek, and it reminded me of indigenous economies and their cooperation within tribal communities and how all of that operated within those indigenous communities. It wasn't until a capitalistic mindset actually was introduced that began to destroy these communities and plot different tribes against one another for survival and for economic purposes. So this was really enlightening. Dr. Rieger, thank you so much for joining us at Good Faith Media for our Good Faith Advocates monthly webinar. It has been a delight. Dr. Rieger is a distinguished professor of theology at Vanderbilt University, and you're going to want to pick up his book, The Capitocene, Theology in the Capitocene, Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity. Dr. Rieger, it has been a pure delight.
Same here. I appreciated the conversation. That one comment on the Willow Project, we probably should have talked about this a little bit more. I was drawing a blank at the moment in terms of, big oil production and pipeline systems. Of course, that's the best example you can give for the capital scene, ultimately trying to control human life. So the good news is not only is there always resistance, but there are alternatives. And as people of faith, we're part of it. So I'm glad to be part of your show. And I think I'm really hopeful for the future. So thanks.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rieger. And to our participants and advocates, thank you so much for joining us this month. We'll be back next month with another special guest talking about a critical issue. Until then, keep living good faith.